In small jurisdictions, response times under 8 minutes correlate with a measurable drop in escalation of incidents. Yet nearly 35% of calls still arrive with incomplete or misleading information. This is the life story of a system built to enforce order in limited spaces. Local law enforcement doctrine shaped not by scale, but by proximity, repetition, and the accumulation of things that do not always make sense at first. It began with necessity rather than design. Small communities required presence more than complexity, someone to respond, to observe, to intervene when needed. Early forms of this system were informal, often a single individual responsible for wide areas, operating without standardized procedure. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Early rural policing models prioritized coverage area over response depth, often assigning one officer to territories exceeding 100 square kilometers. The parents of this system were uneven. Pressures: local governance demanded order. Limited budgets constrained capability. Public expectation required visibility. These forces produced a structure that was simple on the surface, but strained beneath. Lesser-known fact: supply constraint. Smaller departments historically operated with significantly fewer resources, sometimes maintaining less than one patrol vehicle per active officer. Early decisions reflected those limitations. Protocols were minimal. Training varied widely. Much of the work depended on individual judgment rather than institutional consistency. Mistakes were not always documented, and lessons were often personal rather than shared. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Standardized reporting systems were introduced slowly, with some jurisdictions adopting formal incident documentation decades after larger agencies. In his childhood, the system struggled to define what constituted normal. In small areas, repetition creates familiarity, but also blind spots. The same roads, the same people, the same routines. Patterns formed quickly, and deviations were sometimes dismissed or misread. Lesser-known fact: psychological effect. Familiar environments can reduce perceived threat levels, leading to slower recognition of unusual or escalating situations. Training began to formalize, but unevenly. Some officers received structured instruction, others relied on experience. The gap between expectation and preparation remained wide. Small adjustments: radio protocols, reporting formats, patrol routines had disproportionate impact. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Early standardized training programs often lasted less than 12 weeks, focusing more on legal procedure than situational awareness. Growth came not through expansion, but through layering. Communication improved for stradio networks replaced isolated response. Information began to flow between units, even in small teams. The system started to behave less like individuals and more like a coordinated structure. Lesser-known fact: test result. Introduction of two-way radio communication reduced average response coordination time by significant margins in mid-20th century studies. Logistics followed. Patrol routes were mapped. Shift schedules optimized. Coverage, equipment, standardized uniforms, vehicles, basic tools. The system began to resemble larger models, scaled down but structurally similar. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Standardization of equipment reduced maintenance complexity but required upfront investment that many smaller jurisdictions struggled to meet. Manuals expanded. Procedures for common incidents were documented: traffic, stops, disputes, disturbances. The goal was consistency, not perfection. The system learned to reduce variation where possible. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Procedural standardization can limit flexibility, sometimes constraining responses in atypical situations. At its peak, the system achieved a kind of local efficiency. Officers knew their areas intimately. Patterns of behavior were recognized quickly. Response became not just reactive, but anticipatory. A call could be understood before arrival based on history and context. Lesser-known fact test result. Familiarity with local environments has been shown to improve situational assessment, speed by measurable percentages compared to unfamiliar deployments. A defining scenario often unfolded quietly. A routine call noise. Complaint, minor disturbance would carry underlying complexity, known individuals, prior incidents, environmental cues. The system worked best when these layers were recognized early. Lesser-known fact, battlefield improvisation. Offices in small jurisdictions frequently rely on informal knowledge networks community relationships to de-escalate situations before formal intervention. What made it effective was proximity. The distance between observer and event was minimal. Response was not abstracted, was immediate, physical, and often personal. Lesser-known fact with a terrain impact. Rural and semi-rural terrain can significantly affect response times, with unpaved roads and weather conditions causing delays beyond standard estimates. But proximity also introduced complexity. Familiarity could blur objectivity. Repeated exposure to the same individuals and situations created patterns of expectation that did not always align with reality. Lesser-known fact, psychological effect. Repeated exposure to similar incidents can lead to cognitive bias, influencing decision-making under pressure. The cost of the system emerged gradually. Fatigue from long shifts, stress from unpredictability, the burden of decision-making in isolation without immediate support. These were not constant, but they accumulated. Lesser-known fact, medical, psychological effect. Officers in small departments report higher levels of stress related to lack of backup compared to those in larger agencies. Sleep disruption became common. Calls at irregular hours, extended shifts, the inability to fully disengage from responsibility. The system demanded readiness beyond scheduled time. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Some departments introduced fatigue management training only after studies linked sleep deprivation to increased error rates. Then came the moments that defined its limits. Incidents that did not fit patterns. Events that escalated faster than expected. Situations where familiarity offered no advantage. These were rare, but they shaped the evolution of the system more than routine ever did. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. Critical incident protocols were developed to provide structured response to events exceeding routine capabilities. In these moments, improvisation became necessary. Standard procedures provided a framework, but reality required adaptation. Decisions were made with incomplete information, often under time pressure. Lesser-known fact, battlefield improvisation. Officers have been documented using unconventional methods, such as environmental positioning or negotiation strategies, to stabilize unpredictable situations. The system aged as environments changed. Technology increased expectations, faster response, better communication, more documentation. At the same time, communities grew more complex. What had once been simple patterns became layered and less predictable. Lesser-known fact, supply constraint. Adoption of advanced technology in smaller departments often lags due to budget limitations, creating capability gaps. New tools emerge: digital records, surveillance systems, data analysis. These extended the reach of the system, but also increased its complexity. The role of the individual shifted again, balancing traditional observation with interpretation of data. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. Digital systems introduced new forms of error, including data misinterpretation and over-reliance on automated alerts. Replacement did not come as elimination, but as integration. Larger frameworks absorbed smaller ones. Regional coordination increased. The isolated model gave way to networked systems. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. Interagency cooperation protocols expanded. allowing resource sharing across jurisdictions during high-demand incidents. And still, the legacy remained rooted in proximity, the understanding of place, of people, of patterns that cannot be fully captured in data. Modern systems inherited the structure, but not always the depth of that familiarity. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Centralized systems can improve efficiency but may reduce sensitivity to local nuances that influence behavior. What endured was not the idea of control, but the practice of response. A system built to handle the expected, shaped most by what it could not predict. It leaves behind something quieter than authority on, understanding that in small places, the line between routine and the unexplained is often thinner than it appears. 9 seconds is the average time it takes for a routine interaction to shift into a critical one once escalation begins. And in small jurisdictions, there is often no intermediate layer to absorb that change. This is where the system learned that proximity, the very thing that made it effective, could also make it vulnerable. By this stage in its life, the structure of local enforcement had matured into something recognizable: uniforms, radios, defined patrol zones, but the underlying reality had not changed. One officer, one vehicle, one decision point at a time. When something unusual happened, there was rarely a buffer. Lesser-known fact: test result. Incident reviews show that escalation from verbal conflict to physical confrontation often occurs in under 10 seconds. When situational cues are misread, the system responded by tightening its internal language. Commands became shorter, codes replaced full sentences, communication shifted toward efficiency under pressure. It was not about clarity for everyone, but clarity for those already inside the system. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Use of coded language improves speed, but can create confusion when coordination involves external agencies unfamiliar with local protocols in small areas. Repetition creates expectation. The same calls, the same locations, the same individuals. Over time, responses become patterned, almost automatic. This efficiency reduces delay, but it also introduces risk when something deviates from the expected script. Lesser-known fact. Psychological effect. Pattern recognition under repetitive exposure can lead to premature conclusions, increasing the likelihood of overlooking atypical threats. Training adapted slowly. Scenario-based exercises were introduced, forcing officers to confront situations that did not follow familiar patterns. These were not common, but they were necessary. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Advanced situational training often includes randomized variables, specifically designed to disrupt learned response patterns. A defining feature of this phase was the emergence of what could be called quiet anomalies. Not dramatic events, not large-scale incidents, but small inconsistencies, reports that did not align, behaviors that did not match known patterns, situations that felt incomplete. These did not always escalate, but they accumulated. Lesser known fact: production issue. Minor incident reports are less likely to be fully documented in smaller departments due to workload, leading to gaps in pattern recognition over time. The system struggled with these anomalies because they resisted classification. They were not clearly threats, but they were not routine either. Without clear categories, response became uncertain. Lesser-known fact: command doctrine shift. Some departments introduced suspicious activity, classifications to capture events that did not meet thresholds for formal incidents. Improvisation began to play a larger role. Officers relied on instinct, on experience, on subtle cues that were difficult to quantify. Positioning of a vehicle, tone of voice, timing of approach, these became tools as important as any equipment. Lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation. Strategic vehicle placement is often used to control movement and visibility during uncertain encounters without escalating force. Environment influenced these encounters in ways that were not always obvious. Lighting conditions, background noise, even time of day could alter perception and reaction. A familiar street could feel entirely different under different conditions. Lesser known fact: weather, terrain, impact, low light conditions can reduce depth perception significantly, affecting judgment of distance and movement speed. As the system moved through this phase, the cost of ambiguity became more visible, not in large failures, but in cumulative strain. Each uncertain encounter required more attention, more caution, more mental processing. Lesser known fact: medical psychological effect: continuous low-level stress from ambiguous situations can lead to cognitive fatigue comparable to high-intensity short-term stress. Support structures remained limited. Backup was not always immediate. Resources were not always available. The system compensated with procedure, but procedure could not replace presence. Lesser known fact: supply constraint. Response times for backup units in rural or low-density areas can exceed 15 minutes. Depending on distance and terrain, that technology began to enter more visibly during this period. Mobile data terminals, digital reporting, basic surveillance tools. These extended awareness, but also introduced new layers of interpretation. Information increased, but clarity did not always follow. Lesser known fact: countermeasure: digital systems can create over-reliance on recorded data, sometimes reducing attention to real-time environmental cues. At its operational peak within this environment, the system functioned as a balance between structure and intuition, procedures guided action, but decisions often depended on judgment shaped by experience. It was not perfect, but it was effective enough. Lesser known fact: test result. Studies indicate that experienced officers can identify potential escalation cues with higher accuracy than less experienced counterparts, though not without error. A defining scenario of this peak often began as something routiner: stop, a call, a check. The difference lay in recognition: a detail out of place, a response slightly delayed, a movement that did not match expectation. The system worked when these signals were noticed early. Lesser known fact: crew training detail. Training programs increasingly emphasize micro-behavior analysis, focusing on small physical cues that precede larger actions, but recognition did not guarantee outcome. Once escalation began, options narrowed quickly. The system relied on speed, coordination, and judgment often in isolation. Lesser known fact: battlefield improvisation. Officers may use verbal de-escalation techniques combined with controlled positioning to regain stability without physical intervention. The costs remained constant. Fatigue, stress, the weight of decisions made without full information. These were not visible externally, but they shaped performance internally. Lesser known fact: medical psychological effect: decision-making under uncertainty increases cognitive load, leading to slower reaction times over extended periods. As this phase progressed, signs of aging appeared, not in failure, but in strain. The environment changed faster than the system could adapt. Population shifts, technological changes, evolving expectations all introduced new variables. Lesser known fact: production issue. Updating procedural manuals often lags behind real-world changes, creating temporary gaps between policy and practice. Replacement began as integration rather than removal. Regional coordination increased. Shared databases connected previously isolated units. The system expanded outward, reducing isolation but also changing its character. Lesser known fact: command doctrine shift. Centralized data sharing improved information access, but required new protocols for data accuracy and privacy. What remained at the end of this stage was a system more aware of its limits. It could respond, it could adapt, but it could not fully predict. The strange, the unusual, the unexplained, these were not eliminated. They were managed, recorded, and sometimes left unresolved, and in small places, where repetition meets unpredictability, that was often enough. 4 minutes is often the threshold after which a local incident begins to exceed the capacity of a single responding unit, forcing the system to transition from individual response to coordinated control. This is the stage where the system reveals its limits most clearly, not in failure alone, but in the speed at which situations can outgrow the structure built to contain them by now. The doctrine had accumulated layers, procedures for routine, protocols for escalation, communication standards refined through repetition, but in smaller reinforcement, there was always a gap between design and reality. That gap appeared when multiple variables aligned at once. Lesser-known fact test result. Multi-factor incident reviews show that complexity increases exponentially when more than 3 independent variables, people, environment, timing, interact simultaneously. The system responded to this by formalizing escalation pathways. When a situation crossed certain thresholds, unpredictability, lack of control authority shifted outward. Additional units were called, sometimes from outside jurisdictions. Control became distributed, lesser-known fact command. Doctrine shift. Mutual aid agreements between neighboring jurisdictions allow rapid deployment of external resources when local capacity is exceeded. For the individual officer, this shift could feel abrupt. One moment, full responsibility. The next, integration into a larger structure where roles were reassigned, decisions centralized. The system compressed individual autonomy to regain collective control. Lesser-known fact crew training detail. Multi-agency drills train officers to transition from independent operation to coordinated command structures within minutes. But coordination introduced its own challenges. Different units, different training backgrounds, different interpretations of the same situation. Communication had to become even more precise, because misalignment at this stage carried higher risk. Lesser-known fact design compromise. Standardizing procedures across agencies improves coordination, but can reduce flexibility in unique local conditions. Environment continued to play a decisive role. Narrow roads, limited visibility, unpredictable terrain, these shaped movement and response. What might be manageable in an open area could become unstable in confined space. Lesser-known fact where the terrain impact, confined environments amplify sound and restrict movement, increasing both stress and the likelihood of miscommunication during incidents. A defining scenario in this phase often involved a shift from known to unknown. A routine call becomes unpredictable. Additional individuals appear, conditions change. The situation evolves faster than information can be processed. Lesser-known fact battlefield improvisation. Officers sometimes use environmental control block and access points, controlling lighting to slow the pace of escalation and regain situational awareness. At its operational peak in this stage, the system functioned through layered response, initial containment, reinforcement, coordinated action, each layer designed to stabilize the situation progressively. It worked when timing aligned with execution. Lesser-known fact test result. Coordinated multi-unit responses have been shown to reduce incident duration when communication remains consistent and centralized. But even at peak, uncertainty remained constant. Information arrived incomplete, observations conflicted, decisions had to be made without full clarity. The system did not eliminate uncertainty, it managed it. Lesser-known facts, psychological effect. Decision-making under incomplete information increases cognitive strain, often leading to conservative or delayed actions. The cost of this phase became sharper. Physical risk increased, emotional pressure intensified. The presence of others did not reduce responsibility, redistributed. It Each action affected not only outcome, but coordination. Lesser known fact, medical psychological effect. High-intensity incidents trigger acute stress responses, including elevated heart rate and narrowed focus, which can both aid and impair performance. Fatigue layered on top of intensity, incidents, rarely aligned with optimal conditions, time of day, staffing levels, environmental stability. The system operated when needed, not when prepared. Lesser known fact, crew training detail. Rotational command structures are sometimes used to prevent decision fatigue during prolonged incidents. As incidents resolve, whether quickly or after extended effort, the system shifted again, moving from action to analysis. Reports expanded, timelines reconstructed. Every step examined for efficiency and error. This was where evolution occurred. Lesser known fact, production issue. Reconstruction of incident timelines often relies on multiple data sources, including radio logs, body cameras, and witness statements, which can conflict. Patterns began to form across these analyses, not just of what failed, but of what worked under pressure. These patterns informed adjustments, small changes that altered future outcomes. Lesser known fact, test result. Incremental procedural adjustments have been shown to improve response consistency more effectively than large-scale reforms. As the system aged, signs of transition appeared. Technology took on a greater role, real-time tracking, integrative communication platforms, data-driven dispatch systems. These extended awareness but required adaptation. Lesser known fact, supply constraint. Advanced systems require continuous maintenance and training, creating ongoing resource demands for smaller departments. The older structure did not disappear. Individual judgment, local knowledge, physical presence, these remained essential. But they now operated within a broader network, less isolated, more interconnected. Lesser known fact, countermeasure. Redundant communication systems are maintained to prevent loss of coordination during technical failure. Replacement, again, was not removal but layering. Regional systems absorbed local ones. Data flowed across boundaries. The system became less defined by geography and more by connectivity. Lesser known fact, command doctrine shift. Centralized dispatch centers have been adopted in many regions to coordinate responses across multiple jurisdictions. And yet, something remained unchanged. The moment of first contact, the initial observation, the first decision still belonged to an individual in a specific place. No system, however advanced, could fully replace that point of origin. Lesser known fact, design compromise. Centralization improves efficiency but can introduce delays in recognizing highly localized, context-specific cues. The legacy of this phase is not control, but adaptation. A system that learned to expand when needed, to integrate when required, and to accept that not every situation could be fully predicted or contained. In small areas, where distance is short and time moves quickly, the line between routine and the unexpected never disappears. It only waits